Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Audit and Governance Committee. My name is Councillor Marcus Andrews. I've been asked to officiate solely in the election of the chair for the meeting. So pass over to the officer, reference the first couple of items on the agenda.
Good evening, members. I'm Bob Hanton from Democratic Services. I just need to remind members before we start that the meeting is being audio recorded by the Council for the purposes of publishing on the Council website in due course. So please can I remind members to use the microphones if they can at all possibly. The meeting room is fitted with an induction loop. Anyone needing to use it should set their aids to the T setting. There's no scheduled fire alarms tonight. And then finally, please could I ask you switch your mobile phones to silence. Turning to the agenda, item 1 is apologies. I've received no apologies for absence. And there are obviously no substitute members. Could I just ask if anyone has a declaration of interest which needs to be recorded? If not, then sorry.
Yeah, if I just, my declaration of interest is in relation to agenda item 7, the response to a deputation made by the chairman of Kinston Community Association as the chairman of Kinston Community Association that made that deputation.
Could you just give your name for the audio record, please?
Councillor David Brown.
Can I also declare that I'm an auditor and a chartered accountant, so I run my own firm of auditors, so I'm not quite sure whether that's a declaration that I should do or not, but there you go.
Right, moving on. Election of the chairman of the Audit and Governance Committee. Can I have some nominations, please?
Yes, I'd like
Any other nominations?
Nominate Councillor Bartlett.
Right, in the case of 2 nominations, the constitution of the BCP Council requires a secret ballot, and so therefore I will turn to the officers to arrange the ballot. Thank you. And sorry, on both of those proposals we do need seconders.
Yeah, I was about to say that, Chairman. Someone's got the...
I'd happily second Councillor Cox's proposal.
So you're sorry, I haven't got... Councillor Cormack, can you please say it clearly so we've got it on the record who's proposing and who's seconding? So I've had a proposal by Councillor White for Councillor Beasley. Yes. Who is seconding that? And I've also had a proposal from Councillor Williams. Cox, sorry, Councillor Cox.
I'm happy to second that.
Any other nominations? So we now need to go to a secret.
Okay, the election is Councillor Beasley.
Can I ask for the numbers of that election? Because there seems to be some confusion.
I'll ask the Democratic Services Officer to deal with that.
I'll just... Yes, Chairman, there's 5 votes for Councillor Beasley and 4 votes for Councillor Bartlett.
Would it help if I asked the Chief Executive to verify those voting slips as an impartial observer? Thank you, Chief Executive. That takes us on to item 5 on the agenda, which is the election of Vice Chairman of the Audit and Governance Committee.
I would like to nominate Councillor Williams.
Is that seconded?
Seconded.
And seconded by Councillor Dunlop. Are there any other nominations?
I would like to nominate Councillor Cox, please.
I'd like to second that, please.
Are there any further nominations? So there are 2 nominations, which means by the protocol adopted, we'll have to go to a secret ballot again. So members, Councillor Williams has been elected as Vice Chairman. Would you like to join me up here? Item 6 on the agenda is public issues. Mr. Hanton.
Thank you, Chairman. There's one public issue, one statement. The person submitting the statement's not able to be here tonight, so I'm going to read out the statement. It's from Vicky Moss. On behalf of the Branksome Park and Camphor Cliffs Residents Association, I'd like to express concern that the e-petition facility offered by the former Borough of Poole Council has been disabled for nearly 5 months. An e-petition submitted in early March 2000 to a traffic survey in the Branksome Park and Camphor Cliffs area, following concerns over lack of pedestrian accessibility and safety along the footpaths that traverse thoroughfares such as Western Road and the Avenue, was rejected on the grounds that Poole Council would cease to exist in 1 month. The e-petition facility is an essential tool in allowing a community's voice to be heard. We have grave concerns over pedestrian safety in this area, and the requests of individuals for a traffic survey to the Transportation Department has so far been ignored. Please advise when the BCP e-petition facility will be up and running. Thank you, Chair, and that concludes all the statements.
Could I just ask in relation to that, what response will be forthcoming and how we'll convey that to the representative of the association?
Chairman, we'll pass that on to the appropriate department and tell them that the statements have been made to this committee and action will be taken and then reported back if necessary.
Members of the committee satisfied with that? Agreed? Thank you. Takes us on to item 7 on the agenda, which is the response to the deputation made by the chairman of the Kinson Community Association at the last Bournemouth Audit and Governance Committee on the 16th of January 2019. I was present at that meeting. I think perhaps another member may have been. No. In that case, officers definitely were. And I wondered whether the best way of dealing with this was to go through the governance issues to start with, led by Mr. Stannard, and then perhaps the operational issues to follow thereafter. I was expecting to see Kelly Ansell here to do those, actually. Mr. Stannard, is she on her way?
No, I'm dealing with those issues.
All right, so could you deal with them separately? I think the committee would benefit for hearing the governance first and then the operational second. So over to you, and then we'll collect questions for you at the end when you've done both of them. Thank you. Mr. Stannard.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, so quick recap. The deputation was made at the last Audit and Governance Committee of Bournemouth Council, and this has been the first opportunity to consider the issues within that deputation. So whilst the responses in the report are obviously covering those deputation issues, we've also included some contextual issues and historic matters just to explain the wider context of why those governance issues were raised. So if I could take you to the report and page 11. The first question was why, if ever, has the community regeneration and community centre function of the council been audited? Summary explanation there is that our audit plan is based on a risk basis, and it hasn't been audited in the last 6 years, which is the period for which our records are kept. Instead, other forms of assurance are obtained, the principal one being the feedback and the adequacy of arrangements with other centres. However, from an audit context, my internal audit team do audit some of the tangent key financial and key operational issues pertinent to the centre, principal ones being the health and safety, fire safety and building maintenance arrangements, and they were audited in that period, and we've produced reports with adequate assurance in those areas. In terms of question 2, why the anti-fraud and corruption policy, which states that the policy will be communicated to all staff, councillors, contractors and other relevant bodies, clearly is not. Just as a background, the paragraph 13 shows why this question arose, and it arose from a Freedom of Information request from the Kinston Community Association chairman, asking to see the Bournemouth Council anti-fraud and corruption policy. The chairman was erroneously told that that policy didn't exist. This was promptly corrected. However, as you can probably imagine, in a large organisation, 2,600 employees approximately, with a further 250 in shared services, it's very difficult to 100% at any one time have all of that workforce aware of the strategy. But it was a induction mandatory training course. I'm going to work with HR colleagues to see whether we can, in a BCP environment, gain assurance around numbers of people that haven't undertaken that training, and we'll use the HR system to try and do that through self or manager notification in the system. The final question, response to question 3, why in the experience of Kinston Community Association have officers at all levels failed to follow the anti-fraud and corruption policy? Paragraph 15 is the key paragraph there. The simple explanation is the officer in the community regeneration team at the time took the view that the anti-fraud and corruption policy didn't apply. This was clearly articulated to Kinston Community Association, who did contest the view, but some alternatives were offered to the Kinston Community Association as a way of addressing their issues. So, Chairman, I'll leave it there and ask if any councillors would like to ask me any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stannard. Questions? Councillor Cox.
Nigel, dear. Nigel, I have to say I fail to understand why you think it wasn't applicable, the fraud policy, when there's or why it wasn't audited, because there was allegations of fraud going back, it looks like, to 2014. So on that basis, I would have thought that would be immediately flagged if there's an allegation of fraud.
Thank you, Councillor Cox. The key element there was the council's remit or not. From 2004 onwards, the association was run by a board of trustees, and Bournemouth Council having no day-to-day operational control of the centre. There was a contractual payroll issue with a member of staff being in position as technical manager, and was operationally instructed by the trustees, not Bournemouth Council. And we liked it, for example, to any other entity in Bournemouth with the accusation of fraud. It's not the council's responsibility to identify and investigate that fraud.
But as far as I'm aware, there were 3 members that were actually on the Bournemouth Council payroll there, and they had quite a bit of influence over that community centre.
Thank you, Councillor Cox. That's correct what you've said. However, all financial transactions at the centre were approved and must be approved by a trustee. No single officer of linked to Bournemouth in a payroll capacity or not could make a payment in or out of the association. So everything had to be approved by a trustee at some point.
Councillor Bartlett.
With regard to the council employee, the role of that employee, were the allegations made against the council employee, and if they were, would they not have had, would the council not have had some kind of obligation to look into the matter, given that it was one of their staff that would have been concerned?
I think that it's the issue of, again, as I explained in the earlier answer, is the extent of the council employee. In all intents and purposes, the employee was managed by the trustees, not Bournemouth Council. In the benefit of hindsight, as I said in the report, it could have potentially saved a lot of time and effort if the head of audit and management assurance at the time did investigate it. I think it would have, in hindsight, could have been to everybody's advantage, and it could have alleviated some of the issues that have been created thereafter.
Councillor Bartlett.
Thank you, Chair. As I understand it, the council employee was actually managing the site on a day-to-day basis. The trustees wouldn't have been, and they would not have had direct day-to-day oversight of what was going on in the facility. Given the importance of that role and the seriousness of the allegations placed against the individual, would it not have been incumbent for the council to look into it? Surely to ignore it on the basis of the risk, surely the risk of not investigating it was higher than the risk of doing nothing. And now, as a consequence, we are here today, you know, a lot of time and effort having gone into it.
We are where we are. Obviously, it wasn't at the time. I've said, with the benefit of hindsight, I think, you know, there was a good rationale to investigate it in good faith. It wasn't at the time. That's the position.
You want to come back again, Councillor Bartlett?
Could I just, in terms of, you know, the implications for other leased council facilities, there must be a lot of them around. You know, there's lots of charities now have taken on leases and are managing through charities or trusts or whatever. What are the implications of these circumstances for those? Is there any change in our approach to those organisations?
Thank you. I think I allude in one of the paragraphs late on in the report that one of the lessons learned is that we should consider TUPE in these arrangements, which is the transfer of staff to the organisations in question, more formally. At the time, it was done on a pragmatic basis without, you know, the perception or a need for the formal TUPE transfer. I think one of the lessons here is clear that TUPE transfer is there for a reason, and it aligns responsibilities very clearly to the employer.
Certainly, Councillor Bartlett.
Thank you. I understand it was an independent investigation. Can you tell us what the contents of that investigation were? Well, we don't have the report. You know, it would have been, I think, fitting if we could have seen the report. And I'm just wondering if we should still see the report. So whilst I understand it's sort of gone, you know, I still remain a little unhappy about the, you know, the intent or the recommendation to take no further action. Anyway.
Thank you, Councillor. The report is this report deals with the three deputation issues, not the wider issues. So I think it's this committee's gift to either look at those issues yourself or delegate it to an overview and scrutiny committee within the service area. I think that's a decision for you as a committee.
perhaps we'll come back to that question when we get to the recommendations. Vice Chairman?
Thank you. Can I ask who the trustees are of the charity?
Sorry, Councillor. In terms of names, or I don't know the names. I'm sorry, I don't know the names of the trustees. It wasn't part of the remit of this report.
Are there any further questions? So we have 3 recommendations, all of which are for noting. Councillor Bartlett has raised the issue of the report itself and whether or not that's something that members of this committee should see. And I would invite views on that. Councillor Cox.
I'd like to propose that the first 2 are fine, but the third one, that we request a response from Kinson Community Centre to this report. We should also ask for a copy of the investigative report, and then we should defer any matters till later, and so we can investigate it further.
Do you have a seconder? Seconded by Councillor Bartlett. Are there any other views on that proposal? There are not. So we've got the first 2 recommendations, which I would quite like to get dealt with first, if that's agreeable, and then we'll come to the third one after that. So the first 2 for noting, could we take those together? Are those agreed? Please indicate. I think that's unanimous. And then the third recommendation is now supplanted by the move, which has been seconded, and that is that we have copies of the report, and that we then determine the issue of no action or further action at the next meeting of Audit and Governance. I think that is broadly what you're suggesting, Councillor Cox.
I was also suggesting that we get a formal response from the Kingston Community Centre to the report, and let's hear from their side.
In the form of a deputation at the next meeting, or something in writing? A response. So I think it would be helpful if we know which. So if it's in writing, we've got all the papers before the next meeting. A response in writing. Councillor White.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. I just wanted to ask
I guess from my I'll start again. We've had an investigation before at quite a significant cost to the public purse, £12,100 or so pounds, and the findings of that report were that there were no material actions that Bournemouth Council should have done and didn't do. So I guess that's my only and is it in the past? And I think there's a lessons to learn context, and I think we've addressed those in terms of the actions going forward. So that would be my only comment.
Councillor Cox.
I completely agree with the lessons learned part, but I do feel that there are still some more lessons to learn, and certainly from what I can gather from the report, although I haven't seen the report. The words whitewash come to my mind, and I'd like to make sure that it is a proper report, and I'd like to make sure that I am confident in that report, because I certainly heard that that from what I can gather is that no evidence was asked for.
Is there any further response from officers, either from Mr. Stannard or from any other officer? Chief Executive.
If I may, Chairman, it's just really just to get the process right, I think. So I'm just a bit concerned about you've got quite a fragmented process if you ask for something back to the Director of the Audit Committee and a response from Kinston, so whether we should, whether you should just slightly amend the recommendation to request that a named officer seeks those bits and pulls them together to prepare a report for you. That might just cut out the clumsiness of it coming in a fragmented way and would allow Nigel perhaps to put that overview on it.
That's the direction of travel that I think would probably suit audit and governance as best as any. I think the job of this committee is very much around making sure that we have examined the evidence and the evidence has been made available to us. But I think in this particular case, it does need to be channeled in a way that brings it together much more neatly than I think it would if we have a fragmented process. Would that suit your requirements in your move, Councillor Cox? All right, well, so in that case, could we all agree to take that as the way forward? Could you please indicate? Thank you. I think that is unanimous.
Chairman, do you want to say who the named officer is?
Well, I think the named officer is Mr. Stannard. I think he's self-volunteered.
Yeah.
That takes us on to item 8 on the agenda, which is the use of RIPA powers. And I think, Mr. Stannard, you're going to introduce this item as well.
Thank you, Chair. This is a very straightforward report in the sense that best practice suggests that a formal report is done every year in every council to explain to its committee with the appropriate remit for governance around the use of RIPA, which is the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, which is broadly speaking, crudely speaking, covert surveillance. How we use covert surveillance this year. None of the legacy councils used covert surveillance last year, and this report summarises that for the avoidance and transparency requirements of the code.
Thank you, Mr. Stannard. Members have any questions? The recommendation is to note. Can we agree to note? Is that agreed, members? Agreed. Thank you very much. Item 9 on the agenda is 2018-19 Annual Breaches, Waivers and Exemptions Report. And again, that's for you, Mr. Stannard.
Thank you, Chair. Could I just make a general comment about the next 2 or 3 reports, which are all of a similar theme? So there's a single report with 3 appendices for legacy councils, Bournemouth, Christchurch, Poole, respectively. Some of the format of some of the way Bournemouth, Christchurch, Poole did things, respectively, was different. We've not sought to consolidate those or try and normalise those in any way. That's an issue for BCP going forward. So there are some subtle differences in presentations in the next 2 or 3 reports which we haven't tried to address or waste time doing. I'm also going to do a less is more approach, bearing in mind we've got a heavy agenda and it gives you as members the opportunity to ask any questions. So really briefly on agenda item 9, this is around the breaches and waivers and exemptions of the respective council's financial regulations. Breaches is an intuitive term. Have there been breaches of financial regulations? There were some very small number of breaches, as you can see in the summary table on page 21, with a very small monetary value of £3,800. I'll draw your attention to the last one on the list, which is in Poole and breach reference 4. Just for the avoidance of doubt, we don't compartmentalise breaches, waivers, exemptions into financial years. So if we hear of a breach that occurred some time ago, it's transparently reported, and that's why that one's there. So that 2012 breach has come to light, should be reported transparently. That's why it's on the list. In terms of waivers, what financial regs in the respective councils are reflected on that it's sometimes very difficult for officers to follow all of the requirements of financial regs. I'll give you an example. 3 quotes for certain transactional activity. It may not be practical to obtain 3 quotes. We might have a specialist market, or we go out to tender and we only get 2 returns back. So there's some technical reasons why we approve waivers. Waivers are delegated to the CFO to approve with the service director that the waiver is coming out of that particular unit. So it's a positive governance arrangement about approving in advance a decision to not follow the council's financial regs, and this is a full and transparent list in the appendices of all those waivers that were agreed by the CFO in the financial year 18-19. The best will in the world, I'm not going to have all the answers to all 92 or 94, is it? 93 waivers. So if you have any specific questions about any of them, what I suggest is if you ask them tonight, I will then provide a written response, and the written response will go out in the minutes of the meeting for full transparency. Happy to take any questions, Chair.
Just one very minor point, Mr. Stannard. For the purposes of the tape, I think when you were talking about the breaches table, which is at the top of page 23, could you just reflect on what the total is again? Because I think you said 3,800. Could you do it on the mic?
£3,083 is the breach total on table on page 21.
Thank you very much. Page 23, I think.
Okay, different.
It's on page 21 and 23. Summary of page 21.
On both. Questions? Councillor Cox?
Not so much a question as a recommendation, really. I would have thought if you put somebody's name down who's authorised it, presumably they are authorised, then the person that authorising the breach and the waiver, that kind of focuses people's mind, I always think. So if in terms in going forward, that you put down who authorised these breaches, you wouldn't authorise a breach, but maybe you would authorise a waiver.
Just for the avoidance of doubt, Chair, only one person in the organisation can approve the waivers, and that's the Chief Finance Officer. So all of these waivers are approved by the Chief Finance Officer. They are submitted by various officers of the Council, but that is not the approval. The approval is just the Chief Finance Officer.
Vice Chairman, you had a couple of points you wanted to raise.
Yeah, I did. It's further down though.
Thank you. If there are no further questions, we'll go to the recommendation, which is the report for noting. Can we agree to note?
Agreed.
Thank you very much. Takes us on to item 11 on the agenda, the annual governance statement for 2018-19 for the 3 legacy councils, and it's you again, Mr. Stannard. You're absolutely right. Sorry. Item 10, which is the Chief Internal Auditor's annual report and opinion for the 3 legacy councils. But I'm afraid inevitably it's you again, Mr. Stannard.
Thank you, Chair. Chief Internal Auditor's annual report for the 3 legacy councils. Bit of housekeeping first of all. So I was the Chief Internal Auditor for shared services in Poole and Bournemouth. So for the Poole and the Bournemouth Chief Internal Auditor's annual reports, I've authored them. A colleague in Christchurch authored the Christchurch report, although obviously I'm here to cover the questions for that report, so that's just a bit of housekeeping there. In terms of the overall message, the respective audit and governance committees through the course of 18-19 have essentially heard all this before. This is just a summary, an aggregation of what all the committees have respectively heard through the year. So in many terms, it's nothing new. So what it does, it clarifies all the arrangements, it talks about the audit reports that have been issued through the year, summarises the activity against the audit plan, and we've also, just for convenience in terms of comparing in a BCP world, in the summary of the financial implications and human resource sections on page 39 or perhaps 41 given the issue earlier, we've aggregated those costs to illustrate the size of the team. We're the 12th largest aggregate local authority, so that is a big number, it's a big audit team. So those are nice and transparent for you. Any questions? Happy to take them, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Stannard. My glasses on. Councillor Bartlett.
Thank you, Chair. Paragraph 17 talks about the CFO Insights Toolkit, and it's used apparently for looking at value for money and benchmarking, and it was used to support the local government reorganisation Dorset, and in collaboration with Christchurch and Poole. So it's very much work that's been done, presumably, but then presumably will also continue as a tool. I just wondered if you could tell us a little bit about this toolkit, because I'm intrigued as how that will help us in terms of value for money analysis and how it can help this committee as well. Just in very simplistic terms.
Essentially, it's a benchmarking toolkit which doesn't just talk about money, it talks about outcomes as well. So you've got inputs, outputs and money all together. It's quite a powerful tool. You can graph things, you can chart things, you can play around with rankings and understand, relative to you as a council, how do you compare with others of similar size. So that's the ethos. What it really does is bring together all the sources of information that used to exist about 10, 15 years ago. You might have heard of things like SIT for statistics, and so it pulls all of those data sources into one powerful tool, so you can manipulate the data and understand relationships.
Vice Chairman.
Councillor Andrews.
Sorry, Councillor Andrews. Would you like to come in first?
Just as
a Vice Chairman.
Yeah, just a quick question, really. Obviously, we got this audit report on Bournemouth and Poole, which were unitary authorities, so that's the whole entity. Obviously, as regards Christchurch, that was a borough council. The bulk of its services, spend-wise, was dealt with Dorset County Council. Obviously, there's no mention I can immediately find about that. Could you just explain, perhaps at a future meeting, we'll be hearing about the legacy audit of Dorset Council as regards Christchurch?
The simple answer is no, you won't. It's a very clear demarcation that the Dorset Council is responsible for the legacy arrangements of the constituent 7 other councils. So, for example, on the Christchurch and East Dorset alliance, that Dorset Council is approving the statement of accounts, for example, the annual governance statement and the Chief Internal Auditor's annual report for East Dorset. And Dorset County Council themselves have their Chief Internal Auditor has created a similar report for the Dorset County Council legacy arrangements in 1819.
Come back. So what you're saying is, if something is discovered in the Dorset County Council accounts which is to do with Christchurch, we won't get to hear about it, even though it might have some impact on us.
Legacy is gone. So if whatever is found has an implication for BCP, we would hear about it in other forms. So, for example, the Chief Finance Officer is currently working on the disaggregation of the balance sheet. The balance sheets have only just been finalised in the respective statements of accounts of the legacy councils. So the principles of disaggregation of the balance sheet have been agreed, but the actual disaggregation needed to wait for the actual numbers to be live.
I think, Mr. Richards, you wanted to add something to that.
Just by further context, first of all, the Dorset Area Council's Audit and Governance Committee meets tomorrow. County Council's accounts for 18-19 and clearly the Christchurch aspects of that within that overall position. With regards to disaggregation of that balance sheet, once it's formally signed off, we will, or we've already started the work in earnest to disaggregate that in line with the principles that were agreed between the two councillors and the assurance that was given to Secretary of State around those principles, with a view to including a statement on the outcome of that process in the MTFP update report to Cabinet in October.
Thank you, Mr Richards. Councillor Cox.
Sorry, Nigel, just one thing on the paragraph 3 where you say it is the responsibility of the management. Would you include in that the Cabinet and the Audit Committee in terms of the effective control systems? Sorry, in paragraph 3 of Appendix 1.
No, in that context, management is officers.
Okay.
Did you want to come back, Councillor Cox?
Not on that, no, there's another point. Do you want to
raise it now?
In terms of your strategic finance creditors and the recommendations to improve the controls, I mean that's quite a serious supplier setup, and bank account changes are extremely serious and not to be taken lightly on the basis that there's been substantial frauds on that basis. Have you come across any frauds?
So yes, you're talking about the Appendix B on the Appendix 2, sorry, on the Bournemouth report. Is that right? The partial assurance on creditors. Yeah. So yeah, what that was, no is the simple answer. But there has been no fraud, but the issue we found is the arrangements for potential bank mandate fraud. This is where we are told about changes to bank accounts through. So this was not on the main creditor side. It was on the side of direct payments for social care people. So where somebody may be changing their bank account, at the moment the arrangements were that they phone social care up and say, I've changed my bank account, please pay my bank account, please pay my direct payment to this new bank account. Those arrangements needed to be beefed up considerably, and that's what those recommendations were about. So it wasn't the main creditors, it was a less risk because direct payments to social care people are of smaller value.
Vice Chairman.
Thank you. I've got several points, but I'm only going to concentrate on two of them in Annex 1B. The Quality Needs Impact Assessment, the ENAs, is this still a problem? Because Bournemouth had issues with ENAs and then it was all okay. Is it now become a problem again? Because you've given it a partial...
Is the embedding of that across the organisation. So the quality of ENAs is sporadic. It's been tried to address by having some templates and some frequently asked questions and some model ENAs for people to... So that's how we've tried to address it. It's still not fully embedded.
Well, considering Bournemouth in particular was an excellent council in terms of equality 3 years ago, I'm surprised because that was actually one of the things that made it an excellent council. The other question I got is around tourism, the Seafront Cash Office. Is this cash theft or is this just you can't get together the figures?
That particular audit was there are some machines in the arcade, low value machines, the 2p pushers basically, that do not have Z readings. So an alternative control needs to be put in to understand what goes into those machines and what gets taken out of them. Those controls needed to be beefed up. That's why the rating in that particular audit was given.
If there are no further questions, can we agree to note the report? Is that agreed? Thank you very much. That now does take us on to item 11, Annual Governance Statement 2018-19 for the 3 legacy councils. Mr Stannard.
Thank you, Chair. The annual governance statement is a statutory requirement, needs to accompany the respective statements, accounts, needs to feature in that document. If I could take you to the picture diagram on page 79 or 81, depending on which pack you have. What the annual governance statement tries to do is to evidence how the picture is from the Good Governance in Public Sector best practice international framework, and what we've got in respective councils, and indeed what we've got in legacy in BCP, is a code of governance which then goes through and identifies how we achieve each of those outcomes. And the annual governance statement is the document of how we evidence those are working. So it's all well and good. We have arrangements in place to detect and deter fraud. How do we do that? The anti-fraud and corruption policy, is it working? So we gain that evidence from a variety of sources. The process for compiling the annual governance statement is pretty key, and that's outlined in paragraph 7. It's worth just emphasising that. And in terms of the overall statement, the governance arrangements in all 3 legacy councils, in the opinion of the council's senior management team, was that it was effective. However, there were a couple of areas that needed for improvement, and those have been transparently included in the annual governance statement. So for Bournemouth, information governance and the Bournemouth Ofsted inspection of children's services has been included. There's a very large process to assure ourselves that the actions out of that Ofsted report are being addressed, being dealt with in an overview scrutiny in a children's environment, I understand. And then the information governance issue is a legacy from last year's annual governance statement, where given all the changes associated with local government reorganisation, and all the staffing changes and all the documentation changes, it just felt premature to take information governance off the significant governance. Strides have been made in terms of the action plan. Christchurch, nothing in terms of significant governance issues, and Poole also had information governance for the same reasons as I just explained in the Bournemouth example. So happy to take any questions, Chair.
Questions, members? Any questions? No? In that case, I'll take us straight to the 2 recommendations. The first is the annual government statements for 2018-19 for the 3 legacy councils be approved, and we ask the leader and the chief executive to formally sign them. Can we agree that? I think we'll take a show of hands on it because it's not for noting. Unanimous. Thank you very much indeed. And then the second recommendation is that the BCP action plan to address significant governance issues is approved, and a progress update will be presented to the January Audit and Governance Committee. And can we just have a show of hands on that recommendation as well? So both those recommendations are agreed unanimously. Thank you very much, members. Taking us on then to item 12, 12 and 13, in fact. We have with us from our external auditors, Grant Thornton, Paul Dossett and Sam Harding. Those of you from the predecessor councils will probably be familiar with both. I wondered whether the best way of approaching item 12, which is the external audit plans for 18-19, would be for you to do an introduction, if you like, Mr. Dossett, to Grant Thornton's role, as well as the paper itself, because I think it is quite important, particularly for members who are new to audit and governance, that they understand the role that you undertake as much as what you don't undertake. So over to you, Mr. Dossett, and then I think you'll be handing over to Sam Harding for the substance of the report.
So I'm Paul Dossett. I'm a partner at Grant Thornton. In the world of local government audit, the two key things I guess members should be fully aware of is the audit is carried out in accordance with the NAO's National Audit Office, that is, Code of Audit Practice, which is approved by the Houses of Parliament every 5 years, and so we're towards the end point of the Code of Practice that was approved in 2015. And that Code of Practice requires essentially two things: to give an opinion, a true and fair opinion on the financial statements, and to reach a value for money conclusion. Auditors in local government are largely appointed by an LGA company called Public Sector Appointments Limited, whereby local authorities signed up for this company to do all the procurement for them. There are 7 councils nationally who chose not to sign up with PSAA. Those councils are required to set up a separate audit committee to deal with appointments only, and then have their own audit committee like this to deal with the day-to-day. And so PSAA set what's called a scale fee for the audit, and the scale fee is based on a contractual process that the PSAA engage with audit firms. There are 7 firms, accountancy firms, who are approved to do this work, and there are currently 5 carrying it out. The 3 biggest firms carrying out this work are ourselves, Grant Thornton, EY and Mazars, and we, between the 3 of us, cover I think 88% of the market. So all of our work is in that particular context, and probably that's the thing I would sort of say for the time being, and Sam will talk just very briefly through the plans, because these all went to legacy organisations anyway.
Thanks, Paul. I just nicked the plans. So yes, as Paul said, these are the external audit plans that went to the legacy audit committees. As this is a new audit committee, and many of you may well not have been members of those committees, but also to give you some context around the work that we've carried out, I thought it was useful that you had sight of them so you can understand the sort of the audit story. So fundamentally, they set out the basic sort of stuff around materiality and some of the requirements that we are required to let you know under auditing standards. But they also identify the sort of areas that we've picked up as significant risks within the audit and what we're planning to do to address those. And then those are then picked up again in our audit findings report, where we report on the work that we've done and the findings that we've made around those. And that's in relation to both the opinion work, so the true and fair on the financial statements, but also around value for money. The risks are fairly similar across all of the councils. They tend to be standard across local government as a whole, focusing really around the 2 risks that all organisations will have, so revenue recognition and management override of controls. Revenue recognition within the local government sphere we tend to rebut. It isn't seen as a significant risk within local government because you have very good controls in place. There's not a lot of incentive in which for you to manipulate revenue. And a lot of it comes through sort of local taxation and grant income and areas like that. Management override of controls, again, we'll be looking at journals and the controls in place around journals in particular, and estimates and judgments. We're also moving on to the sort of the main risk areas, which are around the big items within your accounts. So looking at property, plant and equipment valuations and also around pension liability. So those are common across all of them. Around value for money, it's a bit strange this year really, because quite often our value for money work looks at looking at medium-term financial plans and financial sustainability into the future. Clearly for Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole, this is a 1 year only. We haven't looked, we're not giving a value for money conclusion or financial sustainability around BCP. That will be for next year. So we've really focused very much on have you sort of set your budget and have you achieved your financial outturn. I'm happy to take any questions on the plans, but really we thought it was useful for you to understand the whole audit story.
I just wondered before we take questions whether our Chief Financial Officer, Mr Richards, would like to make any comments or any observations that might help the committee in terms of the coordination of the work you do and the work that Grant Thornton do for us. Just really trying to demonstrate the joined up approach to all of this.
I suppose the comment I make is that I always regard the external auditor as a critical friend, but I respect the regulatory role that they undertake. But we do work hand in glove, if you like, throughout the course of the year to try and successfully achieve a positive value for money judgment and the unqualified.
Thank you. Questions? Councillor Cox.
So I've got a few. So I'll just list them. The first one is the audit fee is a lot less this year than it was previous year. So was last year's too expensive or is this year's too cheap? I'll just list them out and you can tell me what they are. Then the other one was in terms of your assessment of the pension liability. I think you sort of say the pension the net liability is considered a significant estimate due to the size of the numbers involved. I don't think that's quite right, but it is the sensitivity of the estimate of the changes of the key assumptions. That is the assumption. I don't think the numbers involved necessarily relate to the fact, but it's important. Well, it is important because of the numbers, but also I think you're talking there about a different matter. The other. In terms of your materiality, you've got 2%. I always work on 1%, so I just wondered why you're working on double that. And also in terms of the adjustments that you make to the management figures, I think you talk about reporting them. I think it would be quite useful for this committee to see those adjustments on a summary basis.
Start really easy one. Fees. The fees are set by PSAA. So the fee for 17-18 was set under a previous contract, and the fees for 18-19 were set in the new contract arrangement. The LGA has had a long-term ambition since the heyday of the Audit Commission, which was abolished, obviously, as you will know, in 2015, to reduce audit fees, and they have certainly achieved their goal, and that's why the fees have gone down. In terms of the pension liability, I mean, clearly the risk involved in that number is absolutely about the sort of estimated nature of it. Financial Reporting Council's focus on that, and I'll come back to them later, is linked to both the estimated nature and the size of it, and that's their area of focus. But I take your point. In terms of materiality, we work to a materiality range of between 0.5 and 2%. Local authorities, generally speaking, are well-controlled bodies in a sort of broad material context. The local authorities very rarely have qualified accounts. And just to put that into a historical context, when I started my career, we had a lot of issues with local authorities having qualified accounts and problems when that was back in the mid-80s. But generally speaking, these days, the control environment and framework is better. And so you'll see a range largely between, I'd say, about 1.25 at the lower end through to 2. The reason it's been 2 for these particular bodies has essentially been based on a relatively simple fact that historically there weren't that many adjustments as a result of the audit. And your fourth question, which now escapes me, was, sorry, can you just repeat your... Adjustments management, your adjustments to the management figures. Oh, so in terms, and it's in the next report, so what we're required to do is report all items over trivial. We report to this committee. Obviously, items that are material, we require management to adjust them. Any items that are over trivial but under not material, management has the option to adjust or not adjust, and that's reported to you in the report. So it won't be in the plan, but it will be. Those items are reported in the next item in the next report.
And so, just remind me, what is trivial?
So trivial is 5% of materiality. That's the figure that we use.
Any other questions? Councillor Bartlett.
Thank you. Bit of trivia. On the appendices, there is E is missing off the contents list. Appendix group entities, appendix E. Yeah. Also, the fees, I couldn't make them add up. On the fees page, audit fees, I made it proposed fee 121,883 and final fees 126050. So I unless I'm adding them up wrong here somewhere, but
If that's the case, I can only apologise because that's my fault.
And also the total audit fees, the figure given for the final fee for 2018-19 is different from that shown on Appendix C immediately following it. That's a different figure as well. Final fee is 95796 in the text, and then.
Could you just take us to the page number, please, Councillor Bartlett?
Yeah, page 27.
Which council?
Bournemouth, Appendix C.
So this is
this the plan?
Is the plan or the?
This one.
Oh, sorry. I think that's the next report.
Oh, is it the okay? Sorry, the wrong one. Sorry. We're not on the supplementary pages yet.
Sorry?
We're not on this one yet.
No.
Oh, okay. Sorry, my mistake.
We'll bring those back on the next one. Then. But hopefully you won't need to repeat the whole story. Any other questions on paper 12? No. In that case, we'll go to the recommendation. Again, it's a report for noting. Can we agree to note?
Agreed.
Thank you, members. Takes us on to the next paper, which is 13, external audit, findings report. Mr. Dossett.
Thank you, Chairman. And I think we'd probably like to, again, do a double act on this one. I'll give some context, and then Sam will pick up the three reports. I mean, obviously, these accounts are prepared for the legacy organisations, and that in itself is a task not to be underestimated. In my time, I've audited a number of legacy organisations, moving to new organisations. Was involved in the audit of the creation of the Berkshire Unitaries back in the 1990s, and it is a gargantuan task because you have officers and members obviously moving, data data is not always kept in the right way, sometimes in some examples. So it was a really challenging environment in which to produce and audit a set of accounts, and obviously that would always identify some issues. And I mean, on the able to produce 3 sets of accounts by the deadline of 31st of May, which is the deadline for which draft accounts are to be prepared, and obviously I think the council should be commended for meeting that deadline. So you have that particular context of this set of accounts. The second key contextual point is a national one that impacts on these legacy councils and all councils, and that is the regulatory environment in audit at the moment. Now, those of you who follow the financial and other press would have seen plenty of examples of stories from the Financial Reporting Council, judgments on the performance of audit in general. And the Financial Reporting Council have a very specific function in public audit. So they audit, they review the work of auditors in public audit. You will see from their work in Companies Act audits, they're particularly concerned about whether the auditor reached the right conclusion in terms of going concern, and whether the auditor has done sufficient work to assess the value of the company. So does it challenge valuations and things like that? Does the auditor challenge valuations? And they bring the same broad mindset into their work of local authorities. And so based on their work last year for the 17-18 audit across the country, they have had a particular focus on the 2 issues that we have as significant risks, which are around the pension liability and the valuation of assets. So all of the firms involved in this market have had to spend considerable extra time, I have to say, focusing in detail on these 2 areas. And that has evolved at some councils, not here, but at some councils, the firm appointing their own valuer and their own actuary in particular sets of circumstances. And so what that has led to is an environment where the audit requirements are significantly ramped up from previous years, and that has an impact obviously both on the auditors, but of course on those councils that receive an end of those questions. And that is an important environmental context in which to look at our reports. In terms of the statutory framework, in terms of deadlines that exist with local authority accounts, I mentioned May the 31st, which is the deadline for the draft accounts. July the 31st is a deadline whereby councils are required to publish audited or unaudited accounts. The statutory requirement requires you to either publish audited accounts or accounts that are not audited with an explanation as to why they're not audited. And then the other key date to bear in mind is September the 30th. Now, September the 30th is a date that whereby if the audit opinion hasn't been given by that date, PSAA, the appointing body, includes that council within their report. So they have a report that they make to the LGA and other stakeholders, National Audit Office, which they produce in around December, where they name all the bodies and the auditors involved in those particular delayed opinions. And so we have that as a particularly important contextual point. So they're the key deadlines to consider. So we've conducted our audit of the 3 councils in that environment. Now that has obviously proven quite challenging. Where we sit at the moment is that we are still aiming to ensure that we conclude the audits of Christchurch and Poole councils by the 31st of July. That is subject to another new regulatory factor in some respects, that the Dorset pension fund must be signed off first before we are permitted to sign off the audits of admitted bodies to that pension fund. The Bournemouth audit will be delayed a little further, There are some complex valuation issues that we're going through, and I think that needs to be seen in the wide sweep of conducting 3 audits all at the same time, with officers who have different levels of familiarity with the whole process of those accounts and the history of those accounts. So that is where we are at the moment, and Sam will take us through the key headlines of the individual audits.
Thank you, Paul. So if we start with the audit findings for Bournemouth, as Paul has said, we turn to the headline page, which is on page 3 in the supplementary reports. As with the audit plan, that does set out, there's a lot of information that we give you around the standards under which we do our audits, and also a bit around the National Audit Office Code of Audit Practice. So obviously we did our work, we completed our work on site during June and July, but we were planning on completing our work during June and July. However, some issues have arisen around some of the valuations on Bournemouth, so we're not going to be in a position to finalise and bottom out and resolve all of the queries that we have in respect of that area before the end of July. In addition to that, we've also got some completion of our testing of operating expenses, fees and charges, debtors and creditors and grants, just to sort of top and tail and complete. Also just a bit of testing around related parties, around group consolidation process, and again, as Paul said, we are waiting confirmation of responses to be received from the Auditor of Dorset Pension Fund. So we have done an awful lot of our work. There are just some areas that are still outstanding at this date. Our summary page on page 5, again, just sort of talks about that it is a group audit. So obviously Bournemouth Borough Council has a number of entities of which form part of its group. Amongst those are some of the charities, so the 5 Parks, Russell Coates and the Lower Central Gardens Charitable Trust. Also has some smaller subsidiary companies around BBML and Seascape. So those have been incorporated into the group account. So we have done some work around that. The only significant areas there really are around some of the asset valuations to do with the charities. The other companies are not material, so we just take an analytical approach for those. Materiality, we have revised our materiality slightly from the planning stage just to reflect the final outturn position. Significant risks, the ones that I highlighted really when I talked through the plan. So revenue recognition, again, we have rebutted that for Bournemouth Borough Council, and we haven't found any issues that we need to report to you on that area. Management override of controls, as I said, we're looking at sort of key accounting estimates and judgments, and also around testing of journal entries. I have one item that I did want to highlight to you, which is really looking at the base of our testing of journals. So we look at the ones that are sort of more risky, ones posted by more senior members of staff, posted to seldom used accounts. So we have a sort of like a risk scoring matrix. Some of the tests that we did do were really looking at some of the ones that were carried out by the acting chief accountant. So they were just simple reallocation journals, but they weren't actually authorised, although we have done testing on those journals and there was nothing untoward about them, and they are, as you would expect, they just weren't formally authorised. So it's just a recommendation that there are some procedures that are put in place around that. Yeah, moving on, looking at valuation of property, plant and equipment, and as Paul has said, we have quite considerably this year. So we've reviewed sort of the processes that management has in place around these sort of significant assumptions, because it is, at the end of the day, the valuation in local government is an estimate for these valuations, and really to be said, it's not the figures that are in your accounts and not the figures that you would probably get if you were going to sort of sell off all of your assets. They do have very specific methods of valuing property, plant and equipment, or property in particular within local government. We have things called a depreciated replacement cost, which relates to assets that are sort of very specialised. So that'd be talking about your schools and your libraries, and that's based on a sort of what it would cost to re-provide the service potential. Other assets are also similar on an existing use basis. So those would be things like sort of office buildings. So it isn't quite as straightforward as it would be in the private sector to value some of these assets. And in addition, you have areas like schools where if they go academy, you do just give them away to the Academy Trust at that date. Council houses, again, they are sort of basically valued on a market value, but then there is quite a large discount that is applied to them, which is set by MHLCG, so Ministry for Homes and Communities. So we've been doing work around challenging the valuers and also just looking at some of the changes in values during the year, and that work will be ongoing into August. The next area, as we talked about, really was around the pension fund net liability. Again, we've done a lot of work around assessing the assumptions and looking at the work of the actuary, and the NAO also appoints PwC as an auditor's expert. So they do quite a lot of work of looking at assessing all the actuarial firms that are involved in the local government pension fund across the country, and they give sort of assurance around whether those estimates are reasonable and what they would expect. So we do use our own experts to sort of support us, because obviously clearly we're not actuarial experts ourselves.
Do you use your own experts?
We can do, but if there was anything that we found that was particularly untoward, as for the audit regime as a whole, the National Audit Office appoint PwC as, or the actuarial department of PwC, who review, because there's about 4 or 5 actuarial firms that are involved in providing the figures for the local government pension funds across the country. So PwC assess the various actuarial firms. They look at the discount rates they use, whether their sort of salary increase costs look reasonable, whether their life expectancy figures look reasonable, and they provide a very detailed report to the NAO that is then available to all the audit firms to use. And then our own technical department do another further review of the work of PwC as well. So there's a lot of work that goes on around assessing those estimates. Because clearly it's not something that generally auditors have a lot of, you need sort of actuarial experts to be able to come up with whether those assumptions are reasonable.
And I suppose the other issue on there is that we don't want to end up paying for this twice. So the actuarial work done by Barnett Waddington for the Dorset Fund, you don't want to be replicating that and effectively charging the fund twice through either the employers or the fund itself.
Yeah. I've got to. The next section really is our significant findings around judgments and estimates. And this sort of feeds in really to our sort of management experts sort of area, or management override of control. So obviously this is another area where management could manipulate the accounts, is looking at those, how they sort of do their judgments and estimates. So again, it really feeds into our significant risk areas. So there's more around our land and what the work we've done on lands and buildings, and also around the pension liability, and just gives you a little bit more context. I wasn't going to go through it in detail, but it just gives you some more context about the size of the figures and the scope of the work that we found. Paul touched on going concern. Obviously that's quite a big focus for most companies, less so in local government. In the public sector as a whole, accounts are always prepared on a going concern basis, as long as the services that those bodies carry out are going to continue to be delivered. Because you might think, I think particularly in the context of sort of Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole, those councils have ceased. You might think that there might be a going concern issue there, but because those services are continuing, then the accounts will continue to be prepared on a going concern basis, so we've not found any issues. We will be, however, including a paragraph within our audit opinion just to highlight, similar to what we did last year, just to highlight the fact that the council has ceased. The other areas really around our other communication requirements, and I think just to take you through, the only one I think I wanted to sort of raise really on there is point 6. So in addition to the council having to sort of pull together sort of 3 sets of accounts and prepare for LGR, we have had some quite large or chunky changes to accounting standards this year, with the introduction of sort of IFRS 15, which is the new revenue standard, and IFRS 9, which reflects financial instruments. So although as a whole they haven't really affected how you do business or the sort of the figures in the sort of income statement, there are also quite a lot of disclosures that officers have had to include within the financial statements themselves, and obviously that has required some tweaking as we've sort of moved through the accounts process. And finally, again, I think it's really the last one is 7 is something that sort of Paul was alluding to. So it's really around it has been quite a struggle, I think, for everybody to get the accounts audited and the accounts prepared. Some issues, I think, around working papers as well that we were sort of working together to sort of to address as we go forward.
The council's working papers.
Finally, moving on to sort of value for money, as I said, the issues that we identified in our value for money approach were around financial sustainability and also around the Bournemouth investment asset strategy, because those of you in Bournemouth did have a process of, or did have a policy of looking to increase its income to address sort of the cuts in local government by looking at securing investment opportunities. Clearly, as the councils have now merged, that has reduced so that sort of Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole can take those decisions in a holistic way. And overall, we haven't found any issues with the value for money conclusion, so at this stage it's likely to be unqualified. As far as independence and ethics goes, we do just need to highlight to you that we do undertake some non-audit services on behalf of the council. These relate really to certification of grant claims. So we do some certification work around housing capital receipts and certification of teachers' pensions, which we do on behalf of various government departments, and also the larger one, which is the certification of housing benefits subsidy. So that work will be ongoing as we carry on through the year. And we have some movement in valuation of land and buildings. So obviously the council, to put it into concept really, the council has a very large asset base. It would be very difficult for the council to be able to value all of its assets every year. It would also be very, very costly. So the council has a sort of like a staged approach, which is allowed under the code. The code in the past has always allowed a sort of 1st of April valuation, but obviously that makes it more difficult for the council to be able to demonstrate that the carrying value of the assets is not materially different from the current value. So we have worked with the council and asked the council to look at how they can sort of think about bringing their asset valuations forward, and particularly in the context of BCP, just to minimise the risk of any movements in the year causing material misstatements in those figures. So I'd now like to take you on to audit adjustments. Now, just in the context of the pension fund, some of you may well be aware of this. So in addition to all the additional work that we have done around the pension fund, partway through the year, there was a thing called the McLeod judgment. So this related to a High Court challenge by the Firefighters Pension Fund and the Judiciary Pension Fund. So some of the changes that the government has put in place in respect of public sector pensions was deemed to be discriminatory against younger employees. The government took this to the court, but was not given leave to appeal this judgment. So although at the moment it impacts on firefighters and the judiciary, it will have implications for the local government pension scheme itself going forward. So this sort of came up sort of really during the audit period. So the council asked its actuary to come up with an estimate of what the impact of this would be. And for Bournemouth, it was 5.8 million. I think for Poole, it was 5.1, and for Christchurch, it was about 400,000. So although not material for any of the councils, they have made the adjustment through the accounts. And finally, for Bournemouth, we did find an in-out error on the comprehensive income and expenditure statement relating to the dedicated schools grant. So it's sort of been grossed up on the income and grossed up on the expenditure, but that had no impact on the overall net figure.
So these were the only adjustments that
Sorry, Councillor Cox, your microphone, please.
These were the only adjustments above trivial?
Yes, that relate to numerical figures, or would have or the audit adjustments that we've been asked to make that actually relate to sort of movements in the figures. Sort of moving over, there is some more disclosure type errors that we've made, but those were the main changes to the figures. And even then, the £10 million one was just an in-out. So although it has changed the figures, it hasn't changed the overall impact on the income and expenditure statement. Also, as part of the McLeod adjustment, there is the main impact on this movement is between the pension fund, the pension liability on the balance sheet, which is the figure that we are particularly interested in ensuring is correct, and also on the pension reserve, because it is one of these figures that goes into one of those unusable reserves. The other side of it would go into service costs. So as Grant Thornton, our view is that the Council should analyse that across its current and past service costs, actually within the top half of the Comprehensive Income and Expenditure Statement. The Council's view is that that impact didn't necessarily occur entirely within the current year, because obviously there's changes to the pension fund took place over several years. So that adjustment has been made through the other comprehensive income and expenditure. However, it will all be reversed out in the MERS, and the actual bottom line effect on the comprehensive income and expenditure statement is the same. So it's not something that would impact on council taxpayers. So the council has chosen not to adjust that, and as it is not material, we would not have an impact on our opinion. But as part of our letter of rep, when we come to Bournemouth, but certainly for the others, we will be asking you to just confirm that you're content that in the case of the two councils that we will ask you for the letter of rep today, you're happy that that adjustment's not been made by officers. And then our final audit adjustments for Bournemouth, as it is, really are around the impact of IFRS 15. So that's on the following page. So as I said, and impact of IFRS 9. So I said these are quite chunky standards with quite significant disclosure implications. But I would like to stress they are just disclosures. They don't impact on the actual numbers themselves. So, and fundamentally, the council had done most of the adjustments that it needed to make. However, there were just more words that needed to go in. So we have been working with the council, and those adjustments are being made through the accounts. Another area that we found really was around senior officers' remuneration. So, and I think for those of you that were at the briefing before, there was just an error in that table. It wasn't in the figures itself, it was just in the disclosure where the compensation for loss of office had gone into the salary as well as into the compensation line. So we identified that, and that was being removed, so the salary is now correct within the accounts. And finally, just there were a number of sort of minor typographical inconsistency errors that the council has agreed to change, but which we haven't listed in detail.
Thank you very much, Ms. Harding.
Yeah.
Mr. Dossett.
So I'm just going to say, I think what Sam has done is done a comprehensive review of the Bournemouth report. Obviously, many of the processes and principles would apply to the two other reports. So I was probably going to suggest, Chairman, that members, I'm just going to summarise, and then members move to more general questions rather than going through the other two reports. I think the two key points, I think, is that many of the items we've talked through and Sam has talked through, none of them, and in the other reports, none of them have an impact on the general fund and therefore the taxpayer. So the property, plant and equipment, all of the valuation issues are always reversed out, so they don't impact on general fund levels. Similarly with the pensions. And just in terms of the timing issues, and I talked about timing issues, because of this new regulatory environment and the focus on asset valuations and pension liabilities, a rough estimate would be that probably up to a third of councils will probably not be posting their audited accounts by the end of July. It may be less than that, but it will be a significant number. That figure will then come down significantly by the end of the sort of the 30th of September deadline. So I think that's an important contextual point, because we are in an environment where accounting is getting all the more complex, and the accounts are based on IFRS, which is a very complex set of standards. The deadlines are quite tight, and the expectations of the audit regulatory body, the Financial Reporting Council, have never been higher. So all of that lends itself to some challenges to meet these deadlines. So that's an important contextual point. And I'll close with that, and obviously happy to take any questions that members have got.
Just before we revert to questions, Mr. Richards, I think you wanted to add to that.
I think it's just to say, Chair, that the next item on the agenda is item 14, is a statement of accounts report, where, you know, what I propose to do is set out, if you like, the authority's response as to how the next steps of what has been said in regards to the Bournemouth accounts for 18-19.
Thank you very much, and we'll deal with that when we get to that item. Now, in terms of questions, I think, Councillor Bartlett, you had some. I'm not sure whether all of them are ones that you want resolved at the meeting. I think some of them perhaps are outside, but would you like to rehearse those again?
I would just ask if you just check the fees figures to make sure they correlate, that's all. And I think the annex that's listed, I think you can probably dispense with that because it's already mentioned in the text. Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Councillor Cox.
I suppose I just wanted to understand a bit more about the Bournemouth problem in terms of, you know, at the moment it's been a bit vague as to what the problem is. I understand it's something to do with valuations. I mean, that's a sort of issue that you kind of deal with right at the beginning, if not before the year end. So I don't understand why it's come up now as opposed to before.
If I take that, and Sam will add any comments she's got. I mean, I think that it has to be put in the overall context of producing the three sets of accounts and evaluation, producing the accounts and auditing three sets of accounts all at the same time, all with the same people, means that progressing through all of the issues we have to go through and the number of areas we have to cover is quite extensive. Some of these items will come out as a result of testing and detailed testing and detailed scrutiny. The council has an extremely large property portfolio, so we have to go through all those items and the valuation processes, which vary. They're different processes for different areas. So we have got to this particular set of issues in terms of the valuation process relatively late in the day. I mean, to some extent, you could say, well, why didn't you start with that on day one? Well, we started with 100 other things we had to do on day one. And so it's just going to take its time to work its way through. It is a valuation issue. It is not an issue that impacts on council tax levels, etc. And we're in discussions with the council about the process for taking that forward. It is not an issue that causes us any form of concern about governance or anything else in the council. It's just that it's an issue about how the values have reached particular figures, and we have challenged some of those figures, and some work's been done to look at whether they've been valued correctly in that context. Just to put it in another important point about valuations in local government, especially when councils employ internal valuers, although it can depend on who they employ. There are two very distinct things. When the council's looking to dispose of assets, there's a very rigorous process about determining value for money, and that goes through the council governance processes as it should do. And that is a different process to the year-end valuation process, because that is based on the standards that the CIPFA code requires people to do, which is very different usually to, other than investment properties, everything else has these different odd sort of processes of valuing. So it is a complex picture. What we're not necessarily concerned in this particular case about a sort of governance issue around valuation. This is a sort of technical process issue. Sam, is there anything you want to add to that?
No, other than to say, obviously, you know, valuations is a large area. We do look at it in the beginning. We wouldn't look at it before the year end because it's the 31st of March, so we wouldn't have the valuation report. The valuer has to have a chance to actually put it together after the year end. And so there's a lot of valuations. We look at them, we challenge them. That has to go back and be looked at. So it does take a little bit of time to sort of come to that decision that, yes, that one needs some amending, and so we just want to sort of press further, because clearly if we identify them one in one, then we would need to extend our testing, and that was going to take us a little bit of time to be sure that we're happy with the figures that are there. So it's just like an iterative process. We're pushing back.
The ones that you're challenging, are those internal valuations or are those external valuations?
At Bournemouth, they're all internal.
I think the message we're hearing, though, is that this is a somewhat accelerated process. there is more work to do this time than previously because of bringing all of this together. I'm not sure that these circumstances are unique to Bournemouth, Christchurch and Poole nationally. I wondered, Mr Dossett, whether you could just briefly comment on that, because I wouldn't want members to go away thinking there was something remaining unsaid. I'm actually very relaxed by what I've heard, but I just understand that the pressure of work to get all of this done in that accelerated timetable is quite difficult to achieve.
Yes, Chairman. So in terms of national context, and Sam mentioned earlier the use of PwC as a auditor's expert on pension liabilities. In terms of valuations, there's a sort of national arrangement with the firm Gerald Eve to provide quite significant benchmarking data on a regional basis, and so we have that to consider as well, and all auditors have access to that. In addition to that, where there have been movements that are very difficult to explain and reconcile to the sort of Gerald Eve regional benchmarking, a number of audit firms, including ourselves, this year have engaged with other property firms, valuation firms such as Gerald Eve, such as Wilkes Head Eve, and there are a number of others, to carry out an independent challenge of the work of the valuer. And that's happened within Grant Thornton in at least 10 cases. So it gives you some sort of context of this is a very... the attention on this particular area has been really ramped up, and that is largely because the Financial Reporting Council have determined that pension liabilities and asset valuations are the two most important things they think we should be focusing on.
Chief Executive.
Thanks, Chairman. I think I just wanted to reflect just marginally on the timing of the information, because I think one of the things that potentially has unsettled members is not being aware of the potential delay until today. And the first I heard of it was today, that there is a lesson to learn, I think, about communication between us, that if we do get to this position again, I think informing members in advance, informing the fact that we may not be able to get the accounts agreed would have helped us all with our understanding of it. It did feel a little late in the day.
Thank you. I tend to agree with that. Don't want to apportion blame, but I think there are lessons perhaps to be learnt, and perhaps when we get to the next item we may need to look at the recommendation in the context of those changes. Councillor Andrews.
Thank you very much, Mr Chairman. Just an inquiry. In the Bournemouth report, they talk about the valuations being done internally. I've peeked forward and looked at the Poole report. A lot of their valuations were done externally. No mention about Christchurch. Obviously, with the new council, it's going to have to be done the same way across the whole board. Also, I'm intrigued. I should mention I'm the chairman of the local branch of the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors, that we've been incorrectly labelled as an institute in the report on page 98, and also in the Poole report it calls us the institute. So on the matter of getting things accurate, could we probably call the RICS by its correct full name, please? Thank you.
Point received and understood. Thank you. Are there any other questions from members? No? In that case, could we just move to the recommendation, which again is to note the audit opinion and findings by the Council's external auditors. Are we agreed to note? Thank you, members. Moving on to item 14, which is the Statement of Accounts for 2018-19. And I think, Mr Richins, you're going to introduce this report.
The purpose of the report is to present you with the Statement of Accounts for 2018-19 and ask you to consider and accept the 1918 accounts for Bournemouth Borough Council, for Christchurch Borough Council and for the Borough of Poole. However, as we just heard, as part of item 13, the external audit's finding report of the agenda, you will see that the external auditor is expected to conclude their work and present an unqualified audit opinion on Bournemouth accounts to this committee as well. As set out in their report, their work, although substantially complete, was ongoing, which due to some further work identified in the final stages of their work plan around asset valuations means it is unlikely to be completed by next Wednesday, the 31st of July. Therefore, the proposal now to this committee is that you give a delegation to the Chair of Audit Committee to finalise the Bournemouth accounts as soon as the technical issue around further complex information being requested has been addressed, and that the external auditor is happy to take that approach. The two additional tasks outlined by the external auditor for Bournemouth valuations are as follows. For all valuations carried out for the 2018-19 accounts, a senior review of the valuation and further evidence of how the valuation was calculated. For the 25 most valuable assets in the Bournemouth balance sheet, a desktop exercise to index them from the date of the last valuation to the balance sheet date of the 31st of March 2019 is undertaken. Those additional requests that they're asking us to do, those tasks are unlikely to be completed by next Wednesday, but we will endeavour to do our best to try and do that. If we complete it, then it's all as per the normal situation. If we don't, then we're looking to potentially look upon that delegation as a way of actually finalising that process. So as I said, this work is not expected to take long to resolve, but a notice will also be published on the Council's website setting out the technical delay associated with completion of the Bournemouth accounts, along with details of the delegation, if you agree, and the anticipated process for finally signing off their accounts. That is, as Paul has highlighted, because on the 31st of July, we have a requirement to publish those accounts, and if they're not approved at that point in time, provide an explanation, and that will make sure there's complete transparency around that respect. So in respect of the accounts, can I also highlight the assurance that generally that external auditors have provided, and take the opportunity to remind you that an informal statement of accounts session was held on the 15th of July with the Audit and Governance Committee members, and that the questions asked at that session and the answers provided will be circulated with the minutes of today's meeting to provide transparency to the public around the committee's scrutiny of those accounts. The report also sets out the impact of the work required to complete these accounts, as we heard from the external auditors, particularly around the national issues associated with McLeod, which impact on the cost of the local government pension scheme, but also the additional work required by their extra regulatory regime. I have Dan Povey and Matt Filmer with me here today to help answer any further technical questions that you may have. But however, at this stage, can I ask Dan to explain the extra paper, which is this one, that has been circulated tonight. Dan.
If you could take us through that, Mr. Povey, and then I want to come back to Mr. Richards about the recommendations and the changes that you've just outlined, and get some engagement with the members of the committee before we go any further. Mr. Povey.
Thank you, Chair. Everyone's hopefully has got this summary in front of them. What it really does is it just shows how the figures in the interpretation of accounts section of the covering report, which is page 170 to 171, have changed as a result of the detailed audit work and the transactions that Sam has just gone through in the previous agenda item. They also just show how the accounts that were submitted as appendices to the agenda have been updated as a result of that work. I'll stress there's no change anywhere to outturn to the funding position or the reserves position for any of the three legacy councils. These are all paper accounting adjustments that don't affect the actual financial outturn. All three councils were affected by the McLeod judgment, so that basically means that the net assets in the balance sheet have reduced for each council to the tune of the figures that the external auditors have said, £5 million for Bournemouth, £5 million for Poole, 0.4 million for Christchurch. That reflects the increase in the pension liability and therefore the decrease in the net assets. The other changes that have been affected are really disclosure changes, as Sam has said, mainly around IFRS 15, IFRS 9, which relates to income from customers, and also financial instruments. And there's some examples in the paper of the extra notes we've put in. And the last bit really is to do with group accounts, some additional disclosure and some tweaks to the related parties. I wasn't going to go through every figure on that page in detail, detailed, Chair, but we can obviously answer any questions.
So, could we start with any questions from members on Mr. Povey's part of this item? There don't appear to be any. So, if that's the case, could we then go back, Mr. Richins, to what the proposal is around the recommendations?
Chair, I think with regards to the recommendations, I think if we could take them as printed for Christchurch and the Borough of Poole, which is that you consider and accept the statements of accounts for Christchurch Borough Council and the Borough of Poole, and that you agree that the Chair of Audit and Governance Committee signs the Statement of Responsibilities, including the Statement of Accounts and the Letter of Representation on behalf of the Committee for both those two authorities. And then with regards to Bournemouth Borough Council, that you consider those accounts, which I believe you have done, but we did not look to agree to signing the statement of accounts or the letter of representations until we've done this further piece of work, and therefore in reality what we're asking is that that doesn't take place until we've done that piece of work, and therefore there's a delegation to you as chair to undertake that on behalf of the committee once that work is complete.
And the only alternative to that is for Audit and Governance to reconvene sometime in September to undertake that final piece of work. Because I'd quite like members to understand, I only take on delegation in anything in the local authority, and I think a lot of other people agree with this principle, only in extreme circumstances. So to do so is unusual, and I'd like members to understand what that dynamic is. So the two alternatives are either to do as Mr. Richins has suggested, to me, or to reconvene Audit and Governance at a date yet to be set in September.
Chair, that is completely correct, however, with one caveat. And the caveat is that if in the course of that further work, the external auditor identifies a matter that actually he thinks the audit committee should meet to discuss, then we actually have an extra audit committee anyway.
Yes, absolutely. Sorry, I omitted that, but that would be the natural thing to do in any event. So, could I have views from members coming back on what Mr. Richins has proposed around the recommendations that we've got, so that we can deal with this in an orderly way? Councillor White?
Happy with the recommendation.
Councillor Bartlett?
Yeah, I'm happy with Mr. Richins' proposal.
Councillor Cox?
Yeah, I'm very happy with that, but providing that if there is anything that we come back.
Yes, I omitted to say that, but we would do that as a matter of course, and I would communicate what that materiality was to all members of the Audit and Governance Committee at the earliest opportunity. It's a shared responsibility, and I would always treat it as thus. Self-protection as much as anything.
Mr. Chairman, just one final soundbite on this. Obviously, regrettable, there is a delay. From what I picked up, the delay is getting some valuations or further information on valuations. As a valuer, yes, often we are instructed very, very late in the day. If there is any lessons to be learnt from this for future years, obviously that will be very useful so we don't actually have this reoccurrence in the future.
Mr. Richins?
I totally accept that, and we've talked about lessons learnt as part of the process. But besides lessons learnt, one of the issues for 1920 is actually to develop a consistent approach. Because actually, as a lot of this has shown, is actually each of the three local authorities did things slightly differently. Some did internal evaluations, some external evaluations, and they'll agree as an entity going forward, and as a new entity going forward, is what is the right approach for BCP. And that's, once we've got to that point in time that we're going to meet with the external auditors, meet with the team, pick up the lessons learned, look at that consistency, and try to drive home that, BCP approach going forward.
Thank you. Mr. Dossett.
Yeah, just to reiterate that, Chairman, I think the detailed additional scrutiny that we've been putting in this area has come out of recommendations made by the FRC that were not released until April of this year. Clearly, we have a clear run at 1920 now in terms of the audit sort of side of this thing, and obviously the council has to make its own decision on how it brings all those things together. But the plan that will come to this committee in due course for 1920 for BCP will set those out very clearly, and that will build on the discussions, the debrief discussions we had with the finance team as a result of this year. So I think next year we will absolutely be able to address the point of identifying upfront what are the issues that need doing, what do we need to have by when, and all of the risks that have emerged from this process nationally are mitigated, because that will be part of a process that will start much earlier.
Thank you, Mr. Dossett. So turning back to the recommendations, with the amendment that Mr. Richards has proposed, which I think has general support, could we take the two recommendations together and go to a vote on them? So before we do, Councillor Cox.
I do have one query on the accounts. Is this the right?
Sorry, I thought I'd given that opportunity just now. Certainly raise it.
It's really, and it affects all of the accounts, I believe. Better look for the lines there.
Thank you.
We've got a couple of extra. Your general messages.
One of the ways 008, which was suspect if we were reviewing
tabling
to signal the
when we'll receive a report in the
what meetings a year is in.
Try and make sure that we got, and I hope that we
bring value for money. So I think